Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for being here, Mr. Fadum. I think I remember speaking with you a year ago on the same subject. I enjoyed your testimony, although I will say that a lot of the things that you said in your testimony you stated as fact, but they're more conjecture and opinion than fact. You said that if we adopt the compact, presidential candidates will pay more attention to Connecticut, but that's only an opinion. I also noticed that when you spoke, you have a way of conflating the national popular vote as if we were having a constitutional amendment with the compact, and those are two very, very different things in my mind. So I guess what I want to ask you about really is, assuming the compact, let me forget the compact for a second. If we had an actual constitutional amendment for a national popular vote, and it was now going to be the duty of candidates running for president to woo voters, they're going to make different decisions than they are today about where they go to get their votes. So through the chair, I wonder if you could tell me where you think the candidates would then go.
Through the chair, thank you, Representative Sampson. By the way, I will answer that, but you mentioned the compact. The compact that we're talking about here is also in the Constitution. So the Founding Fathers gave the states the right to determine how to award electoral votes. They also gave states the right to enter into interstate compacts, which is another provision of the U.S. Constitution.
Mr. Chairman, I understand that the states have the rights to choose how they award their votes, but I don't know that there's a mention of them being able to create a compact. I'm not saying that there's any mention that precludes them from doing it either, but the compact itself is not in the Constitution.
Yes, it is. The ability for states, and
I'd love to have that reference.
Before I leave, I will give you the section number. I apologize for not having it right now.
It specifically says that states can combine together for the purpose of choosing out
No, states can enter into interstate compacts.
Of course, yes. That makes perfect sense. Yes.
Right, okay.
I think that's a stretch, though, to try and say that they can that it says in the Constitution that we could create a compact for electing the president.
I'll restate it then. I apologize. The U.S. Constitution says that states can enter into interstate compacts, and the one that is proposed here is an example of an interstate compact.
You get no disagreement from me there, but that is a little bit different than saying that this is in the Constitution. This particular concept, the idea of the states awarding their electoral votes and the idea of states entering into compacts both do occur in the Constitution, and I can understand how we can get to this point, but
your point is well taken. So where will the campaign be collected? And thank you, conducted. And thank you for asking that question. The campaign for president under national popular vote will be conducted in all 50 states, everywhere. I thought you were going to ask the question, well, won't the presidential election just be conducted in big cities across this country? Why would anyone come to Connecticut when they can go to New York or Los Angeles or Chicago? Well, first of all, Connecticut's not a small state. There are 13 small states with 4 electoral votes or less. Connecticut has 7, same amount of electoral votes that Oregon has, for example. So I don't consider Connecticut a small state. But in terms of where candidates will campaign, big cities. So the 50 largest cities in this country comprise 15% of the U.S. population. There's 15% that live in rural areas. That's a total of 30. 70% is in between. So under the current system and under national popular vote, the big cities aren't going to campaign, are going to control it. And I'm just going to cite you one example of a small city, Beaver, Alaska. Beaver, Alaska, population 37 people. Their state senator, it's on the Arctic Circle. Their state senator, when I was in Anchorage last year, showed me a letter saying, thank you for sponsoring the bill. And why? Well, they have cable TV in Beaver, Alaska, population 37. They have a turnout, by the way, of almost 100% when they vote. And the senator said, these are the folks who want their vote to count. So under national popular vote, I think the good news is that the campaign will be conducted everywhere. Television and radio goes everywhere, and there's no reason for any presidential candidate to ignore any area. You're just not going to write off Connecticut, oh, we won't campaign there. So under the national popular vote, you'll, for the first time in the history of this country, see a presidential campaign conducted in all 50 states.
Yeah, you have a wonderful debating style, Mr. Payton. I really admire it. Yeah, I mean, because you make a very compelling argument, except that most of what you're saying is again, it's just opinion and conjecture. To say that somehow they are not going to concentrate on the cities, and there will be places that are not ignored. Take Nebraska. I mean, I don't know what the density of the population is in Nebraska, but if we adopt this national popular vote, won't the candidates try and concentrate on places where they can make the most impact by reaching the most voters at one time? Well, instead of ignoring Connecticut, which I would argue that point. You've said it several times that they ignore Connecticut. The only reason why Connecticut is ignored, if it is, which I don't think it is, because we live in a day and age of national media attention. There is a 24-hour news cycle. There are cable TV news networks that are on telling us about the candidates all the time. They are campaigning for all of us, whether or not they are standing in Wallingford, Connecticut, or they're standing in Pennsylvania. And over time, as you know, battleground states do change, which makes states relevant. You know, the thing is that I don't want to preach. I always yell at other people for preaching up here when we're supposed to be doing a fact-finding mission. But I want to hold your comments to facts. So what about Nebraska? Aren't we basically saying, okay, well, if we do this, we're not going to ignore Connecticut because it's a little more densely populated, but instead you're just going to ignore other places instead. So are their votes less important than ours?
Chairs, through the chairs, Representative, the good news is you want facts? I'll give you some facts. So we do know how a presidential campaign will be run in all 50 states because we can look at how a presidential campaign is run right now. So I won't show this, but you can go to every state. Ohio, let's take Ohio as an example. There were 73 presidential visits in Ohio. When you look at a map of Ohio, they're not all in the big cities. They're everywhere in Ohio. So under national popular vote, the cost of running a television ad in Lincoln, Nebraska, for example, versus maybe running an ad in New York City, the cost of campaigning will dictate that you're going to run TV and radio ads in all states. Your density issue just doesn't really matter because you take the state of Nebraska. I don't know how many registered voters there are in the state of Nebraska. I'll take Alaska. Alaska, I think, has 420,000 registered voters. No presidential candidate is going to say, you know, that's not a dense enough state for us to run TV and radio ads. Let's forget about 420,000 votes. If someone could tell me what the voting population in Nebraska, several millions, no presidential candidate is going to say, you know, we'll just forget about Nebraska. We won't even campaign there. Because why would you abandon millions of votes because density? No, your TV and radio ads are going to reach every single voter in this country. Even the Arctic Circle are going to see TV and radio ads for presidential candidates. So why would you not campaign in Nebraska, Representative? Because you've got millions of votes to be harvested there.
I don't disagree that I think the candidates are going to try and achieve votes everywhere across the fruited plain, just like they do now. My point was not to say that they're not going to do certain things. My point was to say that they're not ignoring Connecticut now.
To the chairs, Representative?
They may take it for granted, but that's not ignoring a state.
Well,
the fact is that there's a big difference between those two things.
Well,
you know, today Connecticut leans to be a blue state. That's not always been the case, and many other states have switched sides over or throughout time. You also paint a picture of only a two-way blue versus red, Republican versus Democrat race. There are plenty of other things that could happen in our presidential elections. All of those things need to be taken into consideration. One of the big things that concerns me about this is assuming you reach the threshold for the compact and you have a certain number of states participating, what about the other states? Those other states are not going to be operating on a national popular vote. They're going to be operating on their own localized national popular vote as we do now, and therefore they're going to award their electoral votes the way they always have. Right. The other concern, and I'll ask you this one, I mean, what about fraud? Somebody just wrote me a few minutes ago about Michigan, and I don't even know how true this is, but I'll take this person who wrote me at their word to say that they had to do a recount in December of 2016, and more than half of the precincts in Wayne and Genesee counties could not be recounted because they had more votes cast than there were active voters. So, direct question. Doesn't creating a situation where the popular vote in another state can influence the electoral votes in my state create a perverse incentive for states to try and influence the election by looking the other way at voter fraud?
The Chair's Representative Sampson, under national popular vote, the issue of fraud is solved as opposed to the current system for one very simple reason. Under the current system, if you went into Michigan, for example, and you wanted to commit fraud, how much fraud would you have to commit in order to steal the electoral votes of Michigan? Right? It's a smaller number. In order to commit fraud under national popular vote, we have millions and millions and millions of votes that are cast. The amount of votes that would have to be stolen under your scenario. By the way, I do not concede the point that fraud exists, but if fraud exists, it's going to be made much, the problem goes away under national popular vote because who can steal enough votes to steal the electoral votes of Florida or of Michigan? It can't happen. So the same thing under your recount scenario. We believe that national popular vote actually takes both of those issues and makes them much better for the country.
I couldn't disagree more about anything that you just said. I mean, I think fraud is a genuine, real thing. It does certainly exist. There is data galore about it. I know that there's a national conversation about this, but it's easily documented with some Google searching. There's news articles all over.
Please note comments from those in the audience. You'll be asked to leave the room if you don't remain quiet and respect the speakers and the elected officials asking questions. Thank you.
Yeah, the reason why we're having this question and this debate here is because everyone, and I have no doubt about Mr. Fadum and the rest of the people in this room, my colleagues and the folks here, is because we all care about having honest and fair elections and choosing the correct person to be our president. There's an honest disagreement about the way we go about that process. And I have a great deal of respect for people on the other side of this debate. And I think it's important for every person to have a full and complete understanding and knowledge of exactly what would happen under this law instead of the talking points on both sides. And that's why I'm trying to flesh this situation out. So forgive me if some of the questions I ask are somehow in a way politicized in one way or another. I'm not asking them for political reasons. I'm asking them because I really want to know from someone who is an expert. The overarching comment that you made more than anything is that the Connecticut, and I wrote this down in big letters on a paper, has zero influence in presidential elections. And I think that that's not true. I think that every state has influence in presidential elections, and I can imagine a whole bunch of different scenarios where you might have candidate A and candidate B, and one of them favors placing a large seaport in Massachusetts, and the other one favors placing a large seaport in Connecticut, for instance. That's a situation where those two candidates, the voters in those two states might vary wildly from the rest of the country because maybe the rest of the country is voting Republican and Democrat, and rather in Connecticut and Massachusetts, we're suddenly voting on a whole different scenario. And it could very well turn out that 7 electoral votes could be enough to decide a presidential election, and therefore we suddenly become a battleground state. To me, that is the scenario that the founders envisioned, which was to protect the sovereignty of individual states so that they get to choose how they award their votes. That's why we have states. Otherwise, we just might as well erase the borders and eliminate the state legislature and the folks here, which I got to tell you, I don't disagree that sometimes we do a lot of things we shouldn't do in state legislatures, but I still believe that we have state constitutions and state laws for a reason. And I represent the people in my district, and I want their votes to go towards the person that they choose. So I just wonder if you'd reconsider the notion that Connecticut has zero influence.
The chairs, to Representative Sampson, yes, I will reconsider that, and I just did, and I'm sorry, I can't reach that. I can't agree with you. You used, I want to give you two responses. You used the word battleground states can change. The word we assigned to that is fleeting. Ask Michigan from 2012. So should the presidential election be based on the fact that every 4 years a state may or may not be a battleground state, and if you just are lucky enough to live in a battleground state, then you get to participate in the presidential election. It's our belief that where you live should not determine where you, if you're in a battleground state or not. And you mentioned the governance issue somewhat, so let me just leave you with a stat. We're only talking about campaigns right now, but let's talk about what happens after the election. So there's a whole bunch of data and facts out there currently, but battleground states receive over 7% more presidentially controlled federal grants than spectator states. Battleground state gets twice as many presidential disaster declarations as a spectator state, and is twice as likely to receive exemptions from No Child Left Behind. And if you take a look at Superfund enforcement actions, that also reflects a battleground status. So not only are we talking about the disadvantage that Connecticut enjoys under the current system, Connecticut and the 32 other non-battleground states are further punished by the fact that as the president looks toward 2020, he or she, or he, is certainly looking at battleground states, and he will be making decisions, governing decisions, based on the fact that he needs to win Ohio or Florida. He doesn't need to worry about winning Connecticut, because Connecticut's going to go blue. He doesn't need to worry about winning Texas, because Texas is going to go red. But if he's got an important decision to make, a funding decision to make, it's a battleground state versus a non-battleground state, the data shows what decision the president's going to make. So that's another negative factor. So no, I don't agree that Connecticut has any influence in the election, nor do I. You have a great congressional delegation, but they are placed in a position where they're fighting uphill against states that can say, Mr. President, you need us in 2 years. There's no reason why Connecticut should be placed at a disadvantage like that, in my opinion.
Mr. Chairman, just a final thought, and I will let you go. I respect everything you say. As I said, you make a very compelling case. I'll just leave you with the thought that I think if you were sitting in the chair 10 years ago or 20 years ago, you would have named different states, and therefore you would have been making the same argument, but proving my point that things do change over time. And adopting a national popular vote would simply shift the attention of the candidates to places where they can get the same votes, which will not likely change. Nebraska, for instance, will be utterly ignored. They could never get their way back to being a battleground state. And I believe Connecticut being a smaller state, we end up being on the less important side of that scale. The beauty of America is that we are a people of free citizens that form together to create a union. But the founders, and ever since then, we have fought very hard to maintain our identity as states. We have loads of bills in this legislature happening right now to contradict what's happening on the federal level. Loads of them. There's things happening because of the Affordable Care Act. You know, we're going to say, we're not going to let those people tell us what to do. We're going to do it our way. And this seems to me to be going the exact opposite direction, because, as was pointed out, at the end of the day, candidate A could get 0 votes in Connecticut and still receive our electoral votes under this compact. And I don't know how, for the life of me, you could define that as one person, one vote under any circumstances. And that's all that I have, Mr. Chairman. Thanks.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Nice to see you, Ms. Ross.
Nice to see you
Thank
again.
you for your annual visit to Connecticut. I want to also just say thank you very much for your daily Facebook posts
thank
about
you.
American history. They have been invaluable to me
Thank you.
since I started reading them daily a year ago. And I would encourage others, if they're looking for a short daily article to learn more about our nation's past and maybe why things are the way they are, I would look up Ms. Ross on Facebook and follow her
Thank
daily
you.
posts. The distinguished chair and ranking member did a tremendous job of covering pretty much everything I could possibly ask you about. But there were a couple of just small side points I'd like to just ask your opinion about. We talked a little bit about the differences between states as far as their individual voting laws. Maybe you could just speak about some of that a little bit. But my big concern there is the potential for creating a perverse incentive for states to change their laws. Forget fraud, forget people in some red district in Texas or some blue district in Illinois or someplace doing something deceptive. I'm thinking about actual states changing their laws to give them an upper hand. Doesn't this compact create a perverse incentive to say, we're just going to have this kind of voting in our state because we want more say than they have over there? Through you, Mr. Chairman.
So I said earlier I would forget problems because there are so many. Thank you for reminding me of one. There seems to be a very casual assumption that if 270 is, they reach 270, that all the other states are going to be so happy, we're just going to all jump on board. Well, I'm a Texan, which is maybe not the best thing in this particular room, but I can tell you we're way more stubborn than that. And I could easily see a state like mine saying, yeah, right, you're not getting a popular vote count out of us. And that would be, by the way, super easy to do. We could just go back to an old form of ballot where instead of saying, okay, here's your all up and down vote for our 38 electors for the Republican candidate or the Democratic candidate, you could literally list them all out. And you literally vote for 38 different people. By the way, you could vote for half of them Republican and half of them Democrat, or maybe you could vote for some mix of Republican, Independent, and Democrat. Who knows? There is no way for the person counting on the other end to know what the intent was in my head when I cast those ballots. This is actually an issue. I'm not just this is not some crazy hypothetical. In 1960, this actually did happen. When people are trying to tally that result for 1960, there's no good way to come up with an answer. And the reason is because in Alabama, you could cast your ballots for 11 different people. And some of those electors refused to pledge to John F. Kennedy. And so there's really just no way. And it doesn't matter in the end because they elected 11 people that went on to go represent them, which is what would happen if my state were to do something like that. But the only point of this whole story is just to say there are so many ways to complicate this for anybody that's trying to get a national popular vote total out of states that do not agree and do not want to participate. So, I don't even know where that's going to go or what that would do if that happened. But there are ways to disagree.
Thank you for that answer. And through you, Mr. Chairman, that goes to your larger point about the difference between the compact and an actual national popular vote, where if we were going to adopt federal policy for voting, that would be one thing. But in this particular case, we are going to come up with a myriad of different rules and requirements. And that's always been something that has concerned me, is that the other states, even if we join the compact, we're going to abide by the rules of the compact. But what about the states that are not part of it? They're still going to be conducting business the way they always did. And then I think you'll see a competition between those states and the compact states in a just complicating the whole thing. This whole conversation to me is all about understanding our history and the sovereignty of the individual states. We are sitting around this table as representatives of our individual districts. We don't have a ballot initiative for everything that comes through this building, and we don't for a very good reason, which is that many of these issues are unbelievably complicated, and we've got to look at protecting the rights of individual citizens across a whole spectrum. And mob rule has a tendency to mean that some folks are absolutely going to be left out when they could have a logical voice representing them otherwise. The best point I think you made sitting up here was, if we think this is such a good idea, why don't we just do it and forget the compact, since we can? So I guess my question is the National Popular Vote Compact in Connecticut's best interest? And then secondly, is it in any state's interest? And why or why not? And that's my final question. And thank you
Yeah.
again for being here.
And you probably know it's a little bit of a rhetorical one because it clearly isn't. But you reminded me of something that I haven't really said much about up here. I did release a book about the Electoral College last year, and it's discussed quite a lot in there. And I think, and I want to be careful how I say this because I'm not trying to be pro or against what should have happened. But what I would like to emphasize is that states have so many choices because of the Electoral College. Okay, so many. And if we get rid of the Electoral College, even through this kind of half-hearted way with MPV, we're stripping ourselves of choices, okay? If Connecticut didn't like the fact that Trump and Clinton were, or maybe you were okay with Clinton and didn't like Trump, I don't know. But any state that was not happy with the choices, they had tools to fix that. I mean, there was so much discussion during 2016 about how we're stuck. I mean, you know, you guys all saw the Twitter account from the Meteor of Death 2016 and all this stuff. Oh, we're stuck, we have to choose between two bad choices. It was never, ever true. It was never true. We had those choices because the states decided to go along with it. But in reality, the states can do what they want to do. Okay, so I give hypothesis to try to remove myself from those candidates and getting myself into trouble with people who do or don't like them, whatever. I tried to give other examples in my book. So as an example, you know, what happens if Watergate breaks after Election Day, but before the meetings of the Electoral College? Do the electors have to vote lockstep for somebody who's being accused of a crime or maybe is about to be impeached? Or can the states say to their electors, yeah, go vote for somebody else? There have been so many examples throughout our history of states that have said, we just don't like what's happening from this centralized national process that's going on right now, so we're going to be ourselves. We're going to do our own thing. I gave the example of Colorado earlier in 1876. They didn't conduct an election because they didn't have enough money. They didn't have enough money because they were a new state, and they'd already had to do this whole election for state reps and stuff, and so they just said, you know what, our legislature's capable of this, and so that was in Colorado's interest that year, and that's what Colorado did. In 1892, Wyoming said, hey, you know, we think women should get to vote. So they did, you know, and it was that easy because Wyoming did what they thought was best. In 1860, there were a whole bunch of southern states that didn't put Abraham Lincoln on the ballot. There were a bunch of northeastern states. I'm trying to remember if Connecticut was one of them. New Jersey's the one I remember. But there were states up in this corner of the country that came up with these really creative, they were called fusion ballots, to try to figure out how to overcome Abraham Lincoln, basically, and to get their own democratic into play. It didn't work. But the point being just that states have so much. Another example actually is 1836 in Virginia. Virginia did not like the vice presidential candidate who was living with a slave, and so they thought that was immoral, and so they just refused to put him on the ballot at all. They would not. It was Richard Johnson, and they put somebody else on the ballot. They made their own decision. Understand I'm not trying to be for or against any particular candidate with these statements or endorsing decisions, but my point is that states have choices. And if we get rid of the Electoral College, we also take away those choices with them. And we just say, okay, from now on, we're okay with the national political parties being in charge of this. We're okay with the mainstream media having too much power. We're okay with the Commission on Presidential Debates or pollsters telling us who are legitimate candidates or who aren't. We have centralized so much in this country and have forgotten something that our founders knew, that the states have an important role to play in this process also. And so what I would suggest to you, and I guess I especially hope suggest to people who are really unhappy with Trump, is that the further we stray from the founders' vision of a state-driven process, the more unhappy, the more divided, the more controversial everything seems to become. And I would argue that this is not a coincidence, and that the best thing we could possibly do would be to try to understand the system better and go closer back to what it was supposed to be, with states actually representing themselves in this process, not some national idea of what they're supposed to do.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Sampson.